Hello and welcome back to my Know by Year. In today's video, I'm going to explore how educating myself led to an increased resolve in my goals, working from the books The Hacking of the American Mind and Ultraprocessed People. You could also consider this the next installment, of I was influenced by you, because The Hacking of the American Mind has been recommended to me in my comments. Ultraprocessed People I don't think I've seen recommended, but I've seen it kind of floating around elsewhere, so you can consider that an influence to read as well. Now, to preface my reviews of these, or my reflections on what I learned in these books, I did read both of these from the library borrowed, so I don't have them physically. I couldn't take physical notes or dog-ear my pages like I did last time, and The Hacking of the American Mind was actually an audiobook, so I was able to highlight notes from Ultraprocessed People here on my Kindle, but I was not able to highlight anything from The Hacking of the American Mind. So I just have a bunch of notes here from when I was listening, when I was able to take notes, around the house, doing other things. I could stop and jot things down. A lot of this was listened to in the car, driving, so I could not stop and take notes, so I'm not going to be as precise with the information that I learned. This might be good, actually. We'll see how this compares to when I am able to highlight and read direct excerpts. You can let me know what gives you a better impression as far as the information that I retained and my feelings as a result of consuming this content, reading these books. Before I jump into the actual responses on the literature, I will say my resolve is only strengthened by consuming this kind of content, this kind of education that reinforces my goals and reinforces the things that I've been trying to do this whole year. And maybe I'm going backwards when I start with this point, but I left The Hacking of the American Mind when I finished that book. At the end of the book, the author, Robert Lustig, who is a medical doctor in the United States, I believe, he goes through the 4 C's of combating the hacking of the American mind, which are connect, contribute, cope, and cook. So connect as in socially, having connections, and he shared a bunch of studies about how connecting on the media is not quite the same as connecting face-to-face with a human. Contribute, creating something that contributes to society, which in my way I'm doing by making these videos on this channel. Coping, which his 2 main points for that were meditating, which I've talked about on this channel a while ago as something that I thought would be good for me to do and probably helpful, and exercise, which I've also talked about on this channel as something that I really feel like would be helpful for me to do, that I should be doing. And his studies that he shared, while I don't have any specific references, they really confirmed that exercising is never going to be a bad thing to do. There's never any circumstance where exercise is going to make it worse if you're not overdoing it, obviously. So, if you're exercising gently, taking a brisk walk, or, lifting some low-intensity weights or whatever it is, it'll only help your system. So it has been confirmed that I really, really, really need to get some exercise routine going in my own life. And that any notions I have that I can't do that because my hyperthyroidism will just lead me to lose even more weight that I'm trying to keep on, or any of these other excuses or justifications or legitimate worries, honestly, that I had about embarking on an exercise routine need to go out the window, because it can only help my health to start an exercise program or an exercise habit. And then cook was his last point, which involved cooking fresh food, learning how to cook your own meals made from scratch or made from unprocessed, less processed ingredients, which goes hand in hand with Ultraprocessed People, which was written by a doctor in the UK, Chris Van Tulleken. His whole book was about how processed food is wreaking havoc on the body. So you could call it, the hacking of the worldwide bodies, hacking of the American mind and the hacking of the human body. Ultraprocessed People is obviously the title of the other book. I'm not trying to retitle any of these. I'm just trying to relate them for my own purposes in this video. But the last point of the hacking of the American mind, the last C rather, being about cooking and avoiding processed foods, avoiding the addition of the cheapest addictive substance, as he calls it in his book, which is sugar. And it's added to so many foods that are readily available to buy in America. And so that's where his last point comes in, is avoiding those addictive substances in food. And then Ultraprocessed People just further rams that point home with in-depth examination of what ultra-processing of food rather, does to our human bodies and how we perceive the experience of eating and getting nutrition. And I do have highlighted excerpts of that book in my Kindle, so I'll get to that one perhaps after I go through The Hacking of the American Mind. Now, the other reason I'm going through these two books is that while they are about general addiction and food, both of these books have extremely intense parallels to shopping, at least the cycle of shopping as it related to me in the years prior to this no-buy year. Now, part of that is because it was an addictive behavior. It was a habit that I felt kind of controlled by. And part of this is because society has set up shopping, consumerism, to be as pervasive as something like eating. Shopping is another thing that we can't totally avoid. We have to buy food, we have to buy shelter, we have to buy basic clothing and basic necessities. So like food, we can't just say we're never going to shop again. We have to buy the groceries, for example, and that's shopping right there. So like dieting, like any endeavor to change your diet, you have to change your shopping in a way that still enables the basic shopping to get done and doesn't allow the basic shopping to skew your habits overall into staying addicted to the practice. So that's why I found it so shockingly, jarringly similar, I think, some of the parallels that he wrote about in Ultraprocessed People. But again, I'm going to get to that one after I go through The Hacking of the American Mind, because my notes on that one are much more brief since I was listening to the audiobook. Going backwards, I suppose, from the 4 C's, one of the points that the author mentions, that Lustig mentions here, is that these are all active points. You must do something to achieve connection, contribution, coping, and cooking. And I have also already talked about this on this channel when I've tried to change my kind of destructive habits and tried to do the more positive habits. I've actually bizarrely had more movement of the needle in my quest to minimize destructive habits this year. Perhaps the very nature of the no-buy is about not buying, and focusing on not doing things has become my kind of mode of operation this year. Not buying things, not consuming as much screen time on my phone, especially not consuming content that isn't going to make me feel good. And I guess my diet has actually cleaned up a little bit as well, so not consuming as much ultra-processed foods. I have had a harder time starting the positive habits, which feels like it's a little contrary to some of the popular advice that I hear about focusing on positive, focusing on what you add, not what you take away. So instead of trying to replace shopping with meditating, for example, I mean, it's not totally true, because I have replaced it with a creative endeavor, which is making these videos, doing this reflection, this journaling, which is kind of meditative in a way. So there is a lot of positive replacement happening. But I guess my point is there are a couple of positive habits that I have tried or want to start and have found it very difficult to do, namely meditation and exercise. Now that I've resumed my normal job, my work, I do feel like my level of connection has increased just because I see people every week now and get to interact with my friends at work. And I, like I've already said, have been contributing through this channel, and then also through my endeavors on my viola project. I have started and tried to maintain a small channel presence over on my music channel as well, and then working towards being better at my current job and striving towards being prepared to win a better job in the future through auditions. So I feel like I've got the connection and contribution C's in a good place. I also connect with my family, and since cutting down on my screen time and being more mindful there, I feel like my quality of connection has gone up there as well. So coping, cooking actually has been going well as well. So coping is the last C to get under my belt, according to Robert Lustig's 4 C's, to improve my mental health, and coping, again, being broken down into meditating and exercising. And again, he has all these studies that support these two practices and suggest that exercising and meditating are super, super beneficial. And, again, the book is full of examples, studies, things he's reviewed, things that he's tracked down to prove that these kind of natural pieces of advice, like things your mother would tell you is what he refers to them as, really do move the needle more on your health than the drugs we're prescribed to treat the symptoms of the issues, right? It's all about preventing the issues from occurring in the first place instead of just treating the surface level symptoms that result. And I have to kind of relate this to my hyperthyroid condition as well, because the condition might have been brought on by stress, by lack of sleep, by lack of exercise even, and I was recently prescribed medication to treat the symptoms. But I have to do this other work to resolve the condition in the first place. And I also want to maintain this work so that I never develop this condition again. While I'm appreciative to have my symptoms treated and grateful that, well, I think in this case, having the symptoms treated will also help me succeed in treating the cause, because treating the symptoms in this case helps me sleep better. It will probably help me exercise once I've had a few more days or weeks of having the symptoms treated. Again, just because I'll have better rest, less fatigue, less kind of other symptoms going on. But it just comes back to the beginning, where if I eat good food, exercise, sleep, take care of my mind, meditate, connect, have a creative outlet, then hopefully my health will be generally taken care of, and I won't be seeking these outlets, these releases that I used to get through consuming things, whether it was shopping, being on my screen, or having things in the background constantly, or any other type of consumerism that I don't really want to be doing, that I was doing not consciously. He also talks a lot about how pleasure is not happiness, and pleasure is that kind of dopamine connected emotion, and happiness is more serotonin connected. And again, he goes into the specifics of dopamine versus serotonin and how they work in the brain and the neural pathways, and how the pleasure behaviors, the drugs, the caffeine, the alcohol, the sugar, the cheapest addictive dopamine inducing substance is sugar, and it's in every food or many processed foods. And he goes on about these specific examples and what they do to the brain. And I do recommend reading it or listening to it for yourself. These book response reviews are not supposed to be a replacement for consuming the actual book yourself. I do also recommend borrowing it from the library. These books are probably not necessarily ones that I would buy for myself. And again, you could argue that for every book, right? You don't need to have a specific book once you've consumed the information inside. But I will eventually be sharing my book collection and the books that I've chosen to keep throughout the years for various reasons. So I'll get into those later. It does tend to be fiction books, though, that kind of open my perspective of life. So it's just my method of curating my collection of books, what I keep, what makes an impact on me personally. Okay, going backwards, the 4 C's were near the end of the book, The Hacking of the American Mind. In chapter 15, this is again close to the end, the 4 C's were chapter 16. In chapter 15, he talks about how healthcare and health insurance is really sick care and not health care. It's treating the symptoms of the disease, but not preventing the disease from occurring. And then he goes into basically the problems of the American healthcare system, which basically can be summarized as how there's money in treating your disease and having surgery for diseases, but there's not money in preventing diseases in the way that insurance has been set up. And certain forces, political forces are moving to try to change this and make it so that we save more money if people are healthier and not if people are sicker, because obviously it would be better for everybody if people were healthy and not sick. The other notes I took from earlier in the book were kind of more about the addiction cycle, the addiction path. And I guess I wrote down here the DSM-5. It's like that database of psychological illnesses or conditions. I guess it lists 11 symptoms of addiction and categorizes them into mild, moderate, and severe. He also talks about how the story of Coca Cola is about how Coke uses 2 legal addictive substances together. And it used to be 3 addictive substances when it was extracted from the coca leaf and contained minor amounts of cocaine, I guess. But sugar and caffeine are the ones that it currently contains in greater concentrations than we would tolerate if it wasn't in the cold fizzy beverage. So I can't actually remember if it was in this book or in the Ultraprocessed People book. They both talked about Coke and how it has so much sugar and caffeine. And we wouldn't be able to eat that amount of sugar if it was just placed in a bowl with a spoon in front of us. We couldn't consume how many grams are in the Coca-Cola, but we are able to consume it in that beverage because it's usually served cold and it's fizzy. This kind of tricks our system into being able to actually tolerate it without it being perceived as too sickly sweet. And then if it goes flat and warm, we don't want to drink it anymore because it's kind of gross, and that's because of all the sugar. And then there's still a problem with Diet Coke because it does make the body have the sensation of getting something sweet, but the body then does not get the nutrition of something sweet, the energy level of that sugar that we perceived as imbibing. And I think this was from Ultraprocessed People. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. When we don't receive that nutrition from the sugar or the energy, the calories from the diet beverage, we then crave more calories elsewhere. And whether or not we actually eat them, it just messes with our system. But back to the hacking of the American mind, sugar and caffeine are dopamine drivers and they're addictive. And also the thing with the sugar is that society enables this addiction. So, you know, you go to your grandma's house and she's made cookies and cakes all the time. You go to any kind of function and there's cookies and cakes afterwards, or again, sugary soft drinks I mean, my work just had an orchestra dinner for the first week of the season a while back, and there were sugary sodas at that as well, provided for free to us as part of the event. And so it's really everywhere in society. It's not the prevalent message that this stuff should be avoided or that it's not real food. And, you know, I'm not advocating that we need to look down on people that consume sugary beverages or things like that. But the book really opened my eyes and my mindset to what we're actually consuming and what society is actually condoning and who is benefiting from this. Because in a lot of cases, the creators of ultra-processed foods are these massive corporations that, you know, their bottom line is increasing sales. And for those customers, again, I can't remember which book it was in because they feel so intertwined. I think it was Ultraprocessed People again, where, you know, the Coca Cola company views customers, if they don't have a Coke every day, they're still potential customers because they could be buying one every day. If a teenager is not drinking Coke yet, they could be a potential customer because they're not buying it. They could be buying it. If a kid is not hooked on Coke yet, we could be marketing to kids and creating customers for life. So things like that, these practices that feel predatory, they're not based on needs that would arise in a natural way. It's like manufacturing the need, the addiction to this sugary caffeinated substance and trying to capitalize on that as far as sales and optimizing their own markets. And Lustig calls Coke a main line straight to the dopamine receptors because of the sugar and caffeine content. He also talks about how neurons adjust to respond less. So you have to do behavior more. So like the dopamine increasing behaviors don't respond to the same level of stimulus. And he also said that dopamine is not back to normal for 12 months after abstaining from your dopamine behavior. So eventually your dopamine receptors will down-regulate, but it takes a long time for them to get there. So I guess in my case, doing a no-buy year for 12 months or attempting this for 12 months is somewhat valid or somewhat legitimate of a length of time to try to do this challenge to down-regulate my dopamine receptors for shopping. But, you know, shopping is one of those things where I think I shared this little tidbit in an earlier video. If it's not come out already, it'll come out in a later video, where after reading these two books, I have come to think of shopping for things that you don't actually have a need for as like eating when you're not actually hungry. And it's not criminal to do that. You know, it's not frowned upon in society, rather, to, you know, go eat a piece of cake when you're not actually that hungry, just because you know eating a piece of cake will cheer you up. Or if you've had a bad day, you can go get an ice cream or whatever. And it's not something that we really look down on people for or vilify people for doing, nor do I think we should do that. You know, spread positivity and all that. We don't need to start jumping on people for these little pleasures. But it has given me another framework for the idea of shopping for things you don't need. And we know that if you indulge in these little treats too often, if it's cake or ice cream or sodas or smoking or caffeine or whatever it might be, if you start making that little pick-me-up treat an everyday habit, then you get health problems. You get fatty liver disease or obesity or whatever. And the same kind of thing, I believe, happens if you shop too much, if that little shopping pleasure becomes a habit for you, and you start to get closet obesity or mentally fatty shopping mental disease or whatever the appropriate conversion is for a shopping habit. And I'm sure somebody out there has done a study on this more comprehensive than my reflection on these books right now. But you get my point, right? If you shop too much as a little pleasure and that becomes a habit, then it's going to lead to an unhealthy outcome. The other notes I have here are from very early in the book, chapter 2, where rewards puts your anxiety at bay. And anxiety makes it hard to experience pleasure. And so for me, situations that induced anxiety led me to do more shopping to try to reach that state of pleasure. And I guess also, it's not just anxiety, but stress and the corresponding elevation of cortisol will lead to addiction as you indulge in these behaviors, engage in these behaviors to try to mitigate your feelings of stress, anxiety, elevated cortisol. And so you turn to those addictive substances, food, sugar, drugs, shopping. And oftentimes it is people who are in the lower wealth or minority category. And again, this is from the book. I'm not just making this up. He said it directly in the book, who will be exposed to these circumstances of higher stress and cortisol and then fall into these addictive behaviors. So, you know, if you're experiencing food insecurity, home insecurity, any of these things, you are more likely to have those physiological conditions of stress, anxiety, elevated cortisol that drive you to turn to these outlets. It reminds me of what happened to me when I moved to New Zealand as a teenager, where I felt totally alone, stressed, lacked control. It was not my decision to move there. And I turned to chocolate at the time and ice cream, sugary foods basically. And it didn't help that New Zealand has a wealth of these sugary foods that are much better than the American versions, in my opinion. And I gained a lot of weight there and then ended up trying to lose all the weight in a very unhealthy way, exercising and heavily restricting my diet. And I don't do that anymore. In fact, I'm actively trying to gain my weight back after being diagnosed as hyperthyroid, but you might already know that. So anyway, those were my main take-home points from listening to the audiobook, The Hacking of the American Mind. And there are some parts in it that I would like to revisit as well. But I guess in some ways it helps to have names for the behaviors, the feelings that I was experiencing in my cycles of consumerism, of shopping in previous years, searching for dopamine and then my dopamine receptors being sensitized and seeking more and more, whether it's buying more stuff or spending more money or whatever it might be, having an explanation for the physiological procedures, the reactions, the setup basically of these behaviors, the environment, I guess you could say. And I think that might be perhaps the biggest message that I took from these two books, is that the environment that we've set up as a human society is really destructive for addictive behaviors. And we have to find a way to escape, to remove ourselves from all of what is around us. And part of it, I think, involves education. And by learning about these processes that go on within us, and also the processes that go on within the big companies that create the products that we become addicted to in varying degrees, varying levels of addiction, we can have more tools to help us remove ourselves from these pursuits of dopamine, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's the environment that makes it difficult to resist these temptations. And then also, again, the final points from Lustig's book is that we need to take care of ourselves first and foremost. Sleep, hydration, food, mental health. If we do the things that we know we should do, basically, and he gives very concrete examples and studies and reasons for doing these things, then the rest of life will be so much easier. And we won't resort to turning to addictive behaviors for dopamine, which in turn kind of makes us neglect our serotonin, which is the contentment side of the picture. And the other thought I was left with is that the health organizations of the world recommend no sugar and no screen time for children under the age of 2. And if we're being that cautious for kids under 2, who in some ways are very vulnerable, but in other ways they have their whole lives ahead of them. So, their bodies are very adaptive. If they're recommended to have no sugar and no screen time, why do I think that I will be served from having sugar and screen time? In some ways, if I look at taking care of my inner child, I know we're not talking about the inner baby, but in some ways, if I want to take care of myself in the best ways possible, maybe the ideal is no sugar and no screen time. And if we could do this for babies in theory, then why couldn't I do it for myself? If I can try to prevent my baby from experiencing screen time or added sugar, then why is it so hard to do it as an adult? Why do I think I need or deserve those things? And again, babies aren't out here shopping for things they don't need. You don't have under 2-year-olds going through stores with a credit card, buying things with money they don't have and haven't earned. As a 2-year-old, they haven't earned any money, and they don't feel entitled to buy any of those things. All of this kind of comes later. And the final points or things that I'm going to look into next, Robert Lustig mentions a couple of references to Brave New World by Aldous Huxley and War and Peace by Tolstoy. And I have been inspired to revisit these works of the literature, and I think I own both of them, or at least I have owned Brave New World at one point. So I'll have to go look into my book collection. Again, I keep on having reasons to film a book declutter. I need to compile all my books into one location and have a little chat with you about them. But I feel compelled to revisit those works as well, with this new lens of anti-consumerism and my experience trying to break out of the consumerist machine. See if I glean anything new from them with this new mindset, new wealth of experience this year. Now we're going to turn to Ultraprocessed People, and I'm going to go to my highlights. To preface all of this, for those of you who haven't read or heard of this, the author is not trying to advocate that you change anything, or he's not saying that you should. Here's his own paragraph that I'll quote to summarize his mindset. So you'll find almost no advice in these pages about how to live your life or how to feed your children. Partly it's none of my business, but mainly I think advice is a bit pointless. What we eat is determined by the food around us, its price, and how it's marketed. This is what needs to change. But I do have one suggestion about how you read this book. If you feel like you might want to quit ultra-processed food, don't eat along. And what he says is that if you continue to eat the ultra-processed food as you learn about how bad it is for you, then you'll be even more turned off of eating it in the future, and it'll come from a place of education and understanding, because you'll be participating in the practice and being forced to examine it as you're learning. And I kind of feel the same with consuming, with shopping. This is kind of why I didn't tell myself I couldn't watch any of that content as my year unfolded. I did take myself off of the short form social medias, but part of that was just from general mental health. I don't feel like these forms are humanizing to creators because you don't really get any context, and it's based on grabbing attention. The algorithm rewards kind of outlandish things. But anyway, I do feel like there are similarities with that idea when it comes to shopping and consuming. Watching these consumerist practices while you learn about how bad they are for the environment, and the corresponding feelings of outrage and the impetus to change that rises up when you educate yourself and see these things at the same time. Now, I'm not saying that these examples need to exist or keep on happening so that we can all be educated to stop, but I'm saying that because the environment includes these examples and it's unlikely that that's going to change anytime soon, educating yourself, feeding this wolf, I guess you could say, feeding this wolf while you still have this one in your system so that when they battle, this one's the stronger one and you can break free from consumerist practices. Okay, after that kind of weird analogy-filled tangent, let's get to my next highlighted point. My next point is about how there's a theory that it's not just that ultra-processed food is delicious and so it creates hedonic overdrive, where we enjoy eating more than we hate feeling full. Instead, it's that the new ultra-processed food environment is affecting our ability to self-regulate. And there are many examples about how food in particular affects the body systems to self-regulate. For example, when you have artificially sweetened food or drinks, fake sugar, it makes you think you're getting real sugar because of the sensations on the tongue. And then when your body doesn't receive the calories from that sugar, it then makes you crave those calories. And so you have more cravings and your functions are not normal. But I feel like this relates very heavily to shopping and the society in which we live. And especially if you spend time on the internet and see examples of consuming, of normalized overconsumption, basically, and the environment is such that that's what you see. And we then have diminished ability to regulate what we own. And again, it's affecting every aspect of our lives. We look at houses built 100 years ago and they're too small. We look at how many pieces of clothing people owned 100 years ago, and it's far fewer than what people own today. And it's not one singular issue, right? It's not just that people are buying more clothing or houses or cars or whatever it is, but it's also just that the clothing is made not to last as long, and so we have to buy more to replace what wears out. It's that trends have become so much more aggressive in their marketing, so we feel compelled to participate in this trend or that trend, even if we feel like we're being selective with what we participate in. The fact that there's so much selection means that even if we select just one trend per season or per year, that might be more than what was normal in years past. So there are numerous factors driving this overconsumption. It's not just a singular problem, but it is a problem of our environment, creating this lack of ability of regulation of our own consumerism. Examples from this book include advertisements, shop fronts, price, packaging, smells. They have significant effects on our brains and bodies that we're only just beginning to understand. The model emphasizes that powerful signals inside and outside the body influence food intake and energy balance far, far below the level of consciousness, involving slippery related ideas like salience, wanting, motivation, and reward. We smear a conscious layer over all this, but eating is far less of a choice than it appears. And while I can't totally equate shopping with eating in this example, because eating in itself is a biological need, whereas the act of shopping is not intuitive, right? It's not something the cavemen did, for example, whereas they had to eat to survive. We didn't have people going into grocery stores with a credit card or money, cash. So it's not exactly a perfect parallel, but I do think that advertisements, shops, price, packaging, smells, what we see marketed on social media, influencer marketing, has all been engineered so that our systems are disrupted and we're not totally conscious about it all. And it's designed to be that way, and we smear the consciousness over it. I mean, I don't know if that's what I'm trying to do here, but when I talk about conscious consumerism versus not conscious consumerism, it does kind of suggest that, there's at least a facade of consciousness over the approach to buying stuff. And I haven't really had the occasion to think of it that deeply before, because on the surface level of it, becoming a conscious consumer from being a non-conscious consumer sounds like a step in the right direction, right? But I think there are examples of even creators online who stopped buying stuff for a while, did a no-buy, and have not really seemed to make the hard pivot into truly being a conscious consumer. They may be much more conscious consumers than they were before. They might be much more discerning in what they bring into their lives. They might even be more minimalist. However, in some cases, there does seem to be a little bit of a further step to go when it comes to being a truly conscious consumer. Or perhaps that's not even the right. Maybe these people are conscious consumers. Maybe conscious consuming is not the true answer to this question of subconscious consuming. Maybe it's just a step on the path. Maybe we become conscious consumers and then we're actually cognizant of the stuff we're buying and the stuff we're wanting and examining the process. But maybe there's another step on the path of really being free from it. Entering this place where we no longer shop when we don't truly need something. And maybe that's not a debate anymore. And that's so far removed from what we see in society today that I can say that out loud and it feels ridiculous. Like, it feels like, why would somebody never shop when they don't need something? Like, shopping for fun is not that bad, right? It's not that harmful to bring in 1 or 2 new pieces every now and then to have fun, have something new, explore a new style. But perhaps that's where normal needs to be, is really not buying something unless you have a need. And categories like makeup in your wardrobe, having a need is extremely subjective. So it's never going to be a black and white system. But I hope, some of what I'm trying to say is getting across. I'm not personally advocating for never shopping for fun, but it's just that becoming a conscious consumer might just be a middle step on the way somewhere on this path. Maybe there's another realm of consumerism that can be reached for both individuals and society at large. And again, he expands on this example in particular here, where the advice of eating less and moving more is not effective for sustained weight loss, because it's as crazy as saying, drink less water to someone who's feeling thirsty. We don't just get hungry and eat. We're controlled by ancient neuroendocrine feedback systems, which evolved to ensure we consume everything we need to pass on a few genes. So it's a complex system that is driving these forces within us, and it can't just be muscled through with the information and willpower of trying to eat less and move more. And the system is sometimes unable to cope with novel food presented constantly in a novel way. The system didn't evolve to handle the concoctions that arrived with the third age of eating. So he talks about different ages of eating, and basically as we've gotten later in third and fourth ages of eating, it's like the more processed the food gets. The author of this book, Ultraprocessed People, has a twin, and the twin struggled more with being obese and eating ultra-processed foods than the author. And so he uses that comparison to make a few points. So this next point is about that. The 20 kg weight difference between his twin and himself was not an exertion of will on the author's part, but either of us in a food swamp where ultra-processed food is the main option and stress us out and we'll gain weight. But because the idea of willpower is so pervasive, it prevents us looking at possible solutions like regulation, food pricing, etc. The twin here didn't feel like his genes were to blame in this new ultra-processed food-rich environment. Rather, he felt like a failure every day. All the more so because I worried about him as the author and started to nag. He said the same thing that many people who live with obesity say, that he felt like he was eating because of his emotions, the stress of his situation, and this is superficially true, but that some people solve emotional problems with food. That's genetic. And then there's another study here about how genes behave differently in different environments, which helps to explain the difference between the author and his twin. And so again, it's a combination of environment and genes. The point he's trying to make here is that he has the same genes as his twin, and because of his environment, his genes were not activated to pursue comfort, dealing with the emotions and stress through food. So again, the environment is what activates those genes or those tendencies to pursue those addictive behaviors, is what I'm getting from this. And I'm not really focused on whether or not I have a gene that made me turn to overconsumption, but it is indicative that it can happen to anybody, right? So it's just another reminder that it's not a reflection of how good or bad we are as a person, if we're an overconsumer or not. It's something that we can all fall into, and then we can all dig ourselves out of if we learn how to not be manipulated by all the forces that are driving us to consume. And again, the fact that we all have different Achilles heels for our shopping is a testament to this, because, you know, some people are captivated by makeup and beauty, and I was never too drawn into that. I could be influenced in that category for sure, but my main vice was clothing and my wardrobe. If it was a universal problem, or an inherent problem, I guess I should say, then it's possible that our vices would look more similar. But it's very individual as to what each person is going to have in their environments and what they're going to be marketed and what's going to be targeting them, you know, even based on things like gender identification. You'll have different ads. So the result is you'll be buying different things or categories of things, different targets of insecurity, you know. Stereotypically, the men are going to get the car ads and the power tool ads. You won't be a real man if you don't have a power tool, whereas the women won't be attractive if they don't have the right clothes and beauty products. And you could turn around and market those to men too. You could market beauty products to men and clothing to men, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was just marketing that could result in men buying more of these things. If they turned it around and said, you won't be a man if you don't have this shirt or whatever, it could probably drum up that insecurity and force or incite men to want to buy these things too. I wonder if there's something to that, because most of the things that we would stereotypically associate with men shopping are expensive purchases, and the women are marketed these tiny little things. Maybe women are more prone to justifying a small treat, whereas men are more likely to buy something expensive in one fell swoop. I don't know. This was not the focus of this book, so I don't have any data points on that idea for you today. The next note is from the chapter about how ultra-processed food hacks our brains, which again is similar to the hacking of the American mind in title. And then there's a comparison to ultra-processed food and smoking here. So it allows the affected person to focus outwards on the industry causing the harm, something we know is helpful in addiction, rather than inwards on personal failure. And it highlights some useful policy parallels. Tobacco control, for instance, provides a template for the regulation of harmful addictive substances. An addictive behavior is my problem, hard to regulate or protect against. An addictive substance being marketed with a monkey to my 3-year-old is regulatory failure. But above all, considering ultra-processed food as an addictive substance solves that problem of abstinence. It's impossible to quit food, but at least in theory, it's possible to quit ultra-processed food. It won't be easy, of course. The contemporary UK is to ultra-processed food what the 1950s were to cigarettes. So again, the parallel here is where you can't quit eating food. You can't quit all shopping, but you can quit shopping under certain conditions. You can quit influenced shopping. You can quit shopping for things that are designed to fall apart. You know, ultra-processed goods, I guess, or goods where corners are cut to make them more repurchased, more trend-based, I guess. You can quit trend shopping. Again, you could fill in the parallels in your own mind here. What might be applicable in your own habits of shopping consumerism? But the idea here is that some of the shopping, or shopping as a behavior, has become addictive to some people. And if we can regulate the marketing that we're exposed to, if we treat it as an addictive substance and then seek to regulate the way that it's marketed, we might have some results here. For the sake of the ones suffering the addiction, for general health, and in the case of consuming goods, of resources and the environment at large. The next point is again about the job of governments to protect the most vulnerable, and how people can make a lot of money working for the industries causing the harm, but they make a lot less being an activist advocating for the people who are being harmed. So we talked to a lawyer, Emily Broad-Leib, who could be making a lot more money working for the food industry. I asked her if she thought about switching sides. I couldn't imagine having a job where I was just making money and making things worse. It's hard to envision how I could do that. What better way to use a law degree than finding these injustices and trying to correct them? Here, I hope that there are people, in fact, I know that there are people working in the same vein against things like fast fashion. He also brings up some food-specific issues that include environmental destruction, including climate change and land use, antibiotic resistance, and plastic pollution. So I would say that 2 of those issues are directly applicable to fast fashion, especially as well. And I mean, I guess in this segment of the video, I'm using fast fashion as a parallel to ultra-processed food, since that is the most readily comparable one, at least in my mind. So the plastic pollution for sure, you can see, if you've ever seen a fast fashion order or haul online or made one yourself, then you know that there's so much plastic involved in receiving the items, and the environmental destruction, climate change, land use to manufacture the resources to make these things and to ship them out globally. Some of these highlights are just kind of shocking things that I learned about ultra-processed food in general. Not all of it is relevant to the goal of stopping shopping for non-food items, so I'm just kind of skimming through here. Again, he's highlighting how resources are consumed because many products contain ingredients from 4 or 5 continents, and we know the same to be true about fashion. They can put made in Italy on the label if the final step of the finishing process was in Italy, but in reality, the raw materials might have been from countries in the global south, and they're just using the Italian label as a way to achieve more credibility or quality association rather than made in Bangladesh or India. There's a chapter on how ultra-processed food is designed to be overconsumed. And again, I think we know the parallel here, right? Fast fashion, and to some extent fashion in general, is arguably designed to be overconsumed. Fast fashion for sure is designed to be overconsumed just because it wears out so quickly that you have to replace the pieces if that makes up a core element of your wardrobe. Fashion in general, with the pushing of trends and increased presence of these in our lives in advertising and on social media, it's becoming to feel that way, where there is still a sector of fashion emphasizing slow wears, slow fashion, wearing it for a long time, buying it once and keeping it forever. But the majority of companies with the bottom line of making the most money possible, creating the most customers possible, creating repeat customers, are pursuing overconsuming as their goal, to hook customers, to try to get as many people to buy and people to buy multiple times, whether it's through aggressive marketing, pricing tactics, sales, etc. There's another chapter about selling solutions to the problems that they cause. His examples here are about how Nestle entered a weight management campaign where, a lot of Nestle's products are contributing to weight gain. And then they're also selling products, meals designed to help you lose weight, lean cuisine and stuff like that. And I feel that this is some of the messaging behind some of the more sustainable fashion companies, or the sustainable efforts of the main fashion companies. Let's put it that way, main fast fashion companies. So when you see H&M having a conscious collection, for example, it's kind of like this example where they're trying to target a problem that they are causing with a product line that they are also a part of. And throughout the book, he illustrates how companies have limited choice about the food they make and how they make it. Many of us don't have a choice about whether we buy it, but there are 2 groups that can make slightly different choices to create better situations. In the case of food, it's governments and the medical profession. And, in the case of shopping, it's the same, where governments could have better regulations for these companies or more incentives for them to produce responsibly instead of irresponsibly. And then the next chapter is on what we could ask governments to do. So first of all, not take money from the food industry to have the clashes, conflicts of interests. And secondly, to restrict marketing. And I think we can agree on that by now, is that marketing for everything in general needs to be better regulated so that it's not predatory and it's not contributing to an unhealthy society, whether it's insecurities that it cultivates, the feelings that we need something, the feelings that... I was recently seeing this thing about a spray that reveals the hair on your faces, which is encouraging women to feel like they need to shave their face. And it's just highlighting this system where anything can be sold as an insecurity. If there's a product geared to fix that problem, the problem can be made, it can be cultivated, when there's not really a problem there to begin with. And I guess in some ways it makes me think about when influencers take money and promote a product, and how that kind of damages the relationship of the influencers and their audiences, and how credible the advice of the influencer becomes as soon as they start accepting money from the industry that they're representing in a supposedly objective way. And he has examples about, for example, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and a note about how there was no understanding that the interests of, for example, KFC and those of obesity campaigners are not and cannot be aligned. KFC made a persuasive case that it cares, and I'm sure it does, but the company is required by its owners to sell. And again, regarding influencers and influencer marketing, it's the same, where they say that they care, especially those ones with a focus on minimalism, conscious consuming, financial health, any of the responsible practices related to shopping. They say that they care, and then they turn around with a product to sell. And it rings the same chords, it rings the same bells, strikes the same chords. They can say that they care, they can say that they have these values, and I'm sure that they do. But the company is required by the contracts that they've signed to sell the product or to promote it in a way that makes it look attractive. In some cases, they share their own insecurities and then say that this product helped them with that. And I can't look at it the same way anymore. And part of it is reading this book and seeing all these cases of him, the author here, going in depth about how it relates to the ultra-processed food industry. And we're getting close to the end here. He reiterates here that when it comes to specifics, the author doesn't think that the aim of policy should be for people to eat less ultra-processed food. That's not the business of politicians. He doesn't want to be told what to do any more than his twin did when he was getting onto his twin about his food habits. I sincerely don't have a moral opinion about eating ultra-processed food. None of my friends believe this, but it's true. I don't care how you feed yourself or your child. The goal should be that you live in a world where you have real choices and the freedom to make them. So his ultimate argument is that the systems are taking away the choice that people have. And again, I just might be lacking the information to not have a moral opinion about fast fashion shopping and marketing and influencer tactics, but I can agree with that notion that the goal should be to live in a world where we have free choice and that we're not manipulated. And perhaps the problem would be solved without having to get moral about it. But I can't fully agree right now, where I'm at today, that I don't think it's a moral problem, or that I don't have a moral opinion, in my case, about shopping. I don't have a moral opinion about ultra-processed food. Maybe it's the concept of food versus material goods, because I can agree with the author about food, but as far as material goods go, I don't know if I can totally divorce myself from the moral feelings, at least, even if I do try not to impose morals on other people, at least so far on this channel. And he has a chapter now on what to do if you want to stop eating ultra-processed food. If you personally want to stop eating ultra-processed food, then you could try what his twin and he did. Go on an 80% ultra-processed food for a few days. Grapple with it, and you'll understand about fantasy foods. You'll bite into some cheap chocolate or some tangy crisps, and you'll hear the voice in your ear of one of the scientists he consulted with for this book. It's not food, it's an industrially produced edible substance. That was by Fernanda Rauber. If you recognize in yourself that you might have an addictive relationship, you can go online and search for the Yale Food Addiction Scale Test. And I saw Shauna Raipari do this with the Bergen scale for shopping, so I might have to do that too. If you think you're addicted, get some help if you can, whether from a friend or a relative or your doctor. In this case, I'm seeking help by reflecting on myself on the internet and, turning to the community of like-minded people on here. You may want to take an approach that you will eat some ultra-processed food, but will steer clear of the problem products. So shop for some things and steer clear of the problem categories. You may recognize vulnerable moments in foods so that eating an ultra-processed food sandwich for lunch is not going to prompt a binge, whereas eating crisps at home alone while hungry may be more likely to. So again, maybe shopping with friends or family isn't going to be problematic in your future, but shopping at home online at midnight is going to be something that you stop doing. You may find it much easier to be abstinent. His twin and him find this to be the best approach. Our relationship with it was an addiction, and for us, abstinence is the only solution. And again, this makes more sense perhaps when you consider ultra-processed food to be fast fashion or cheaply made trinkets. And remember that ultra-processed food is just a substance through which other problems are realized. There are often reasons why we eat it. These are often the same reasons why so many of us struggle with addiction to other substances. Ding, ding, ding. You may have to fix some of those other problems before you can tackle ultra-processed food. You may know what they are. Again, get some help. I think that's a pretty direct parallel that time. And then this is my last highlighted note. We are ultra-processed people not just because of the food we eat. Many of the other products we buy are engineered to drive excess consumption. Our phones and apps, our clothes, our social media, our games and television. Sometimes these can feel like they take much more than they give. The requirement for growth and the harm it does to our bodies and our planet is so much part of the fabric of our world that it's nearly invisible. You may find that abstinence from some of these other products is helpful too. So there we go. The last note ties it all together beautifully as far as how both of these books, even though they're not directly correlated with a shopping addiction or a habit of shopping too much, they have so much helpful information and examples that parallel what I was experiencing related to buying things in previous years. that I feel like I've got a lot more tools in my toolbox, a lot more information in my arsenal now to tackle the urges when they arise, to spot the manipulation happening, and to be able to take a step back and say, am I being manipulated? Am I being influenced to want something? Who is benefiting from this? What is being harmed from this? Who is being harmed? And I have a lot more values to weigh up. It goes beyond just, should I buy this or should I not? Should I spend the money or should I not? There are greater forces at work here. And again, it's not the individual's responsibility per se, but we can have a greater sense of power, control, agency, feeling of freedom if we feel like it is our choice to make and that we're not being controlled. So that's just my little 2 cents on those 2 books. A little bit of influenced from my comments to read these books. And I do recommend reading or listening to these for yourself. There is a warning here that Ultraprocessed People is largely about food, and if that's going to be a triggering topic, then proceed with caution and proceed having been informed of that. But if you are interested in the food side of conscious consuming as well, it might be an interesting read. I did find it really, really fascinating. Many of the studies that I don't have enough time or reflective parallels to summarize here are extremely interesting and have left me with a lot of food for thought, pun intended. Okay, I'm worried that this is going to be way too long, so maybe next time I won't do 2 books in the same video. But I will bid you farewell for today, and I would love to read your food for thought in the comments. Clearly I've got food on the mind now after talking about that book, but I will say bye for now and see you in the next one.